Hi everyone. So, as you can see, I'm wearing my Braves gear because tonight, as I'm making this video, the Braves will play Game 7 of the NLCS. And by the time you see this video, we'll know whether they made it to the World Series or not. But I'm so confident in Ian Anderson's ability to pitch and in our offense's ability to put up runs that I am going to go ahead and wear my Braves gear because I think that there will be a World Series that features the Braves and the Tampa Bay Rays next week. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to do in this class. So, this week we start the 20th century, and we're going to start at the beginning of the 20th century. And we're going to start in the second decade of it, which is the 19 teens. So, we looked at imperialism. We looked at imperialism last week, where England owned a quarter of the land in the entire world, and everybody thought that England was this great paradise, and that the rule of Queen Victoria had brought great prosperity to the country and even to the world, really. And there was a lot of national pride. And then in 1914, World War I breaks out right after the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. And at that point, Europe went into what was called the Great War. And we now call it World War I, even though, it wasn't really a world war. It was more of a European war. But, there were some Asian countries like China and Japan involved. The United States would eventually get involved. But, World War I shattered the whole illusion that the British Empire was untouchable, and shattered the illusion that it was this great empire that would rule forever. So, we look at the World War I poetry, and we'll start with Rupert Brooke, who was patriotic, and he was a very good-looking young man, and so England used him as a propaganda machine to say, hey, dying for one's country is a beautiful thing, right? You die for your country in war, it is awesome. Then we're going to look at two other poets, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, who are going to be soldiers who see the destruction that war brings about, and they come back and they write poetry, as did many of the so-called trench poets, and they say, dying for one's country is still dying, and there's nothing glorious about it. In fact, it's actually a pretty brutal way to go if you die by poison gas, or if you come back home and you're missing a leg, or something like that. So our discussion this week is going to look at, is dying for one's country a glamorous thing, or is dying for one's country gruesome, and getting wounded for one's country? What happens to the soldiers that come back from Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or wherever the soldiers are, and they only have one leg left, or they are in a wheelchair for the rest of their lives, or they can't hardly take care of themselves because of some war injury? Is that a glorious way to go, or is it gruesome? So we'll take a look at that in the discussion. Then the other thing that we're going to look at, or the other poet we're going to look at, is going to be William Butler Yeats. Now, for those of you that aren't fond of poetry, you'll be happy to know that this is the last week you'll have to read any poetry. Everything beyond this is either going to be essays or short stories. And that's, for the final 4 weeks of the semester. But for the purposes of this week, we have to look at William Butler Yeats, because you can't look at 20th century British literature and leave him out. That would be a crime, because he wrote for over 50 years. And he's probably the last, he and Robert Frost of America are probably the last poets who made a living strictly through poetry. Now, there are people writing poetry now, but they're not as popular or as well known as Yeats or Frost were. So we'll look at William Butler Yeats, and there are 3 time periods in his writing career, and we're going to look at all 3 of them. The first one, we're going to read the Lake Isle of Innisfree, where he goes back to his Celtic roots. So remember, we looked at this at the very beginning of the semester. The Celtics were a bunch of tribes that inhabited what the island that would become England, and they had a special. Their quality of poetry was like a sing-song kind, like there was a musical quality to it. And William Butler Yeats tried to get back to that, and he does that with the Lake Isle of Innisfree, and he looks at how this island, and it does exist. If, in fact, if you look at the slideshow on him, in fact, I hope you're looking at all these PowerPoints that I post every week. If you look at that slideshow, you'll see a picture of the Lake Isle of Innisfree. In fact, there is now because of this poem, there's actually a visitor center there. People will visit this island just because William Butler Yeats wrote a poem about it. So, look at the Celtic influence on that. Then Easter 1916 is about an Irish rebellion. Remember, England was an imperial power, yet Ireland did not want to be a part of Great Britain. And to this day, there are parts of Ireland, particularly in the northern part of Ireland, that are not willing to become a part of the United Kingdom or Great Britain. And so Easter of 1916, some Irish nationalists took over, or tried to take over, Dublin. And the British, because they were fighting in World War I, they had troops overseas, thought, wait a minute, what in the world's going on here? So they, what the Irish found out was that England still had enough troops in England to go and squash the Irish rebellion, and then the leaders were all executed. And William Butler Yeats was personal friends with many of those leaders. And so he's going to write Easter 1916 as kind of a eulogy to his friends who had become executed for being leaders of the Irish rebellion on Easter Day in 1916. And then Leda and the Swan. This is towards the end of Yeats's career, and he would look back at mythology. And so, if you know anything about mythology, you know that Leda was this beautiful woman. Zeus, of course, was the king of all gods, but Zeus had the ability to transform himself into other animals. And so he decided, when he saw Leda and how beautiful she was, to turn himself into a swan. He would then end up raping her. Now, the product of this rape was 4 children. One of those, which was Helen of Troy, upon whom, Helen of Troy eloped with Paris and moved off to Troy. And the Greeks did not like that very much, so they went to war with Troy to try and get Helen back. And that war lasted 10 years. You got the Odyssey out of that, you got the Iliad out of that. We can go on and on forever. But in Leda and the Swan, Yeats is looking at Greek mythology as an inspiration for his poetry. And so that's what's going on in that poem, is that Leda is being raped. But in the end, Yeats is going to take the attitude that this rape, although horrible, as all rapes are, imagine being raped by a big bird. That's not going to be a pleasant thing. But out of that came civilization as we know it today. So even though it was a horrible event, some good came out of it. So those are the William Butler Yeats things, and that's what your paper that you're going to write is going to be about. So the discussion will be about war and whether it's glorious to die for one's country or not, and then the paper is going to be about Yeats. So I figure that you've got to read 6 poems, but every one of them is really short, and I think that you can do it. So that's it for this week. We are launching into a more modernist time, and I guess that is a bit of a pun because we will talk about modernism and postmodernism in the readings this week. But that's where we are. So final week of poetry, looking at an icon in poetry in William Butler Yeats, and looking at, again, like we've been doing, the social consciousness of the World War I poems as written by Rupert Brooke, and then by people that opposed him, such as Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen.